In youth's spring it was my lot to haunt of the wide world a spot, the which I could not love the less, so lovely was the loneliness of a wild lake with black rock bound and the tall pines that towered around. This is Carolina Haints. Welcome, dear listener, to the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Mankind can be capable of heroic, selfless acts, or unspeakable atrocities. One thing will bring out the true nature of a man's character faster than anything else: war. During the Civil War, troops were technically forbidden from plundering the civilians. However, it was going to happen. So the standard rule was that they weren't allowed to abuse non-combatants, even verbally, and that they were to leave the families enough rations to survive on. The temptation to get rich at the expense of others was too much for many soldiers to resist. One of these was Colonel David Fanning. He amassed a group of around 50 men, and together they made their headquarters on an island in Hannah's Creek Swamp near Smithfield, North Carolina. Once there, they conducted themselves more like pirates than soldiers. They pillaged and plundered the Piedmont Triad, taking what they liked, burning homes and killing anyone they pleased, sometimes slaughtering innocent people for the sheer fun of it. They called themselves Fanning's Marauders. They raided whatever they wanted with impunity until they chose the wrong house. John Saunders was a Confederate lieutenant in the area. One day he received word that Fanning's Marauders had attacked his parents' house. As usual, they took everything of value and burned whatever was left, and slaughtered everyone there, including Saunders' wife, who was staying with him while he was at war. It took every ounce of willpower that Saunders had not to desert his post and go after them. But he had sworn an oath to fight for the Confederacy, and he was a man of honor. Eventually, word of the incident reached his commander, and Saunders was chosen to lead a troop of soldiers to apprehend David Fanning and his men. It didn't take long for Saunders to find Fanning's Island, but gaining access to it without alerting the gang was not going to be easy. However, the locals were eager to get rid of Fanning and offered Saunders some assistance. They lent the soldiers some clean clothes, and Saunders' men entered the island under the guise of being deserters wanting to join his gang. Once on the island, Saunders went about arresting Fanning's Marauders. The advantage of making their headquarters on an island was that no one could easily get on the island without being seen, but it also made it impossible for Fanning's men to escape. Soon, all 50 men were rounded up and brought before Saunders. He interrogated them to discover where they had hidden the loot. In true pirate fashion, they buried it on an island. Saunders' men recovered it and did their best to return it to the rival families. They also searched the men to find what they had on their person. Saunders searched Fanning personally, and what he found made his blood run cold. A gold cross. His mother's gold cross. The find sealed their fates. Fanning was forced to watch and listen as one by one each of his men were hung from the trees of Hannah's Creek Swamp. The previous man was still gasping and twitching as another noose was being fitted around the next victim's neck. Before long, Fanning was begging for his life, and the swamp was decorated with 50 rotting corpses, swaying in the wind. But Fanning was not among their number. He was spared for the moment. Saunders marched Fanning to the burned-out remains of his parents' property, to a tree standing beside the family cemetery. Fanning was hung before the Saunders family grave so that they could have their revenge from the afterlife. Ever since that day, visitors to Hannah's Creek Swamp will occasionally claim to hear voices, the tortured, dying moans of Fanning's men begging for their lives. Some even report seeing phantom shapes swinging in the trees. A few miles away from Hannah's Creek Swamp is Mill Creek Swamp. 200 years ago, the land surrounding the swamp was a small plantation with a bridge over the swamp itself. The land was owned by a particularly cruel slave owner known only as Lynch. Whether that was his last name or his favorite hobby is unclear, but it was said that the only thing that could bring a smile to his face was the sound of a whip cracking against the skin of another. Lynch decided that the land around Mill Creek Swamp needed to be cleared back. It wasn't going to be an easy task, but 2 or 3 men should be able to handle it in a day. However, Lynch wasn't willing to spare 3 men from the fields. He chose one man, a seasoned slave known as Old Squire. Lynch figured that with the proper motivation, it could still be done in a day. Of course, by the proper motivation, he meant that Lynch personally planned to supervise. And so, Old Squire set to work with only an old rusted hoe, while Lynch sat nearby on his horse and mercilessly whipped the old man if he felt the work was going too slow, which it often was. At first, the old slave endured. The scars on his arms and back reminded him that this was his sad lot in life. But as the day drew on, his tolerance waned, and as twilight started to fall, Old Squire was glad this day was coming to a close. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. He set down his hoe, wiped his brow, and breathed a sigh of relief. But the job wasn't finished, and Lynch refused to let him leave until it was. He pulled the lantern out of his saddlebag and lit it so Old Squire could continue to work in the dark. He could hold the lantern in one hand and still whip him with the other. At some point in the night, the old man snapped. He swung his hoe with all his might. The blow struck Lynch in the head, nearly shearing it off. The lantern fell to the ground on one side of the horse and Lynch's lifeless body on the other. Frightened by the scent of blood, the horse bolted into the night. Old Squire panicked. He quickly dug a hole in the soft, swampy marsh and buried Lynch. He went back to the slave quarters and didn't say a word about what had happened. The following morning, Lynch's blood-stained horse returned to the stable and his family became concerned. When the slaves were divided into search groups, Old Squire made sure to be on the swamp group so that he could steer the search away from the grave. Soon after the incident, people crossing the bridge reported strange happenings. Some said that their torches would extinguish on the bridge and reignite when they were on the other side. Some never made it across because their horses refused to budge. Many people claimed to hear the crack of a whip and a small ball of light hovering over the bridge. According to the story, Old Squire never told a soul his secret until, finally, he made a deathbed confession. The next day, a group of men armed with shovels went to the swamp to look for the slave owner's body, but, according to legend, they didn't have to. The body had mysteriously found its way from the mire of the swamp to the center of Mill Creek Swamp Bridge, and since that day, most of the hauntings have subsided, but people still report seeing a glowing ball of light around the swamp. The Great Dismal Swamp straddles the border of North Carolina and Virginia. 100 years ago, it encompassed around 2,000 square miles, roughly the size of Delaware. Currently, it's only a third of that size. Over the years, the dismal aspect of the swamp had made an impression on visitors. Painters and songwriters have used the swamp as inspiration, along with several poets, including Robert Frost, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. As you would imagine, in a swamp, one of the biggest dangers is the land itself. When it was first explored by William Byrd in 1728, he wrote this about the Great Dismal Swamp.
The ground of this swamp is a mere quagmire trembling under the feet of those who walk upon it. Never has rum, that cordial of life, been found more necessary than in this dirty place, a miserable morass where nothing can inhabit.
But the Great Dismal Swamp was home to vastly more dangerous things than the land. It's home to bears, wildcats, countless snakes, and every creepy, crawly thing imaginable. But these weren't the reasons why the natives avoided the swamp. Spooky stories go back well before the Europeans arrived. Native Americans told stories about the Lady of the Lake and her deranged lover searching for her in death. The lady is seen rowing her canoe on Lake Drummond, a 5-square-mile lake at the heart of the Dismal Swamp. The Lady of the Lake has inspired great poets to immortalize her tale. Among them, Irish poet Sir Thomas More wrote a ballad, The Lake of the Dismal Swamp, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Lake, both portraying the lady's story. But the lady was only one story. William Byrd experienced many strange sights and noises on his expedition, and rather than diminish or be debunked in the past 300 years, the reports continued, to such a degree that many legends and rumors have emerged to explain them. Tales of witches and fairies, and ghosts and other supernatural beings. Some people report hearing frightened, panicked French voices calling out for mercy in the swamp. During the Revolution, France sent ships to aid the colonists. One of these ships encountered a British man-of-war off the coast of southern Virginia. Outgunned, the French vessel fled into the harbor, but the man-of-war gave chase. The Frenchmen separated onto smaller boats, but still the British were hot on their heels. Finally, they ditched their boats entirely and fled into the swamp on foot. But, relentless in their pursuit, the British found them and slaughtered them. And many Bigfoot sightings have been reported in the swamp over the years. However, anybody who knows the history of the swamp might question whether all of these sightings were really Bigfoot. Perhaps some of them were the Great Dismal Freak. But it's an honest mistake. The Great Dismal Freak, also known as the Great Dismal Monster, is said to be a huge, bipedal, 8-foot-tall creature covered in fur and smelling of rotting flesh. But where many witnesses see human-like qualities in Bigfoot, no such claim can be said of the freak. It was described as a wolf man. Oh, and it's also said to have bright, glowing eyes. On March 20th, 1901, the Richmond Dispatch published the following article. The strange dismal swamp monster, which one day this week killed 7 of Ed Smith's dogs, ate 2 of them, and later attacked Mr. Smith himself, has been seen again. Mr. Smith lives about 12 miles from Suffolk. Last night, L. Frank Ames, a merchant who lives near Bennett's Creek, saw the same thing and suffered from its ravages. Hearing a strange noise, Mr. Ames went out with a pistol. He thought at first it was a strange dog. When he learned it was the much-sought monster, Mr. Ames shot several times, but without effect. The thing growled savagely. Being sent after it, 6 dogs refused to have a conflict and fled in terror. They could not be induced to make an attack. The unknown animal escaped without being harmed. Afterward, it appeared at the home of Henry Jordan, colored, and sat defiantly on a covered well. The description is like the one furnished by Mr. Smith: a large, gaunt form, long yellow hair, and vicious eyes. Sounds crazy, right? Well, reports continued in the early years of the 1900s. Exactly a year later, the Little Falls Herald wrote, "Another monster has come forth from the Dismal Swamp jungles and is spreading alarm among farmers around Driver, 12 miles from Suffolk, Virginia. Last week, an unclassified animal not indigenous to Highlands terrorized residents of Pleasant Hill, so that they were afraid to leave home at night. After being chased by numerous armed posses, this beast was killed by Harrison Walker, a colored hunter. Now, Edward Smith, a farmer of Driver, says that a strange being visited his premises and killed 7 dogs, 2 of which were eaten, while the other 5 were mutilated. Another dog took refuge under a barn, and Smith, hearing the dog's yells, went out with a pistol. The monster sprang upon him. Smith fell, and the beast tore his clothes to shreds. He finally beat it off, but the revolver, being corroded, would not fire. Whit Walker, of the same neighborhood, says the animal visited his home too. From Smith's description, the animal is larger than a wolf, with shaggy, yellow hair, long head, and sunken eyes. It is gaunt and vicious. People are wondering what will next come from the unexplored swamp made famous by Tim Moore's verses. The more superstitious regard the visitation as supernatural. Yet another tale comes from a man named Henry Pruitt on the North Carolina side of the swamp. Henry was out hunting when he encountered the creature. He described it as a huge, bear-like creature with black fur, although other sightings saw a beast with yellow hair, alluding to a group of these things residing in the great expanse of the swamp. Henry said that it chased him, running on 2 legs and
screaming like a panther.
That's right. It chased him, and Henry ran. Ran like his life depended on it. He was scared to death, but he got away. Later, safely back in town, his fear turned to anger. He told his friends about
the most frightening varmint I had ever seen.
The next day, Henry and his buddies set out to hunt the beast, and in fact, they trapped it. Henry brought it home and caged it on his property. Locals came from far and wide to gander at the freak. The thing in the cage was definitely not human. Despite what Henry offered, the beast refused to eat in captivity. It slowly wasted away until it died. Sightings of the Great Dismal Monster are still sporadically reported, and Wolfman appearances have instilled rumors of true-life werewolves in northeastern North Carolina. To learn more about these stories, check out North Carolina's Haunted 100 Volume 1, Seaside Specters by Daniel Barefoot. There's Ghost Stories of North Carolina by Edric Thay. North Carolina Legends by Richard Walser. And Haunted North Carolina, Ghosts and Strange Phenomena of the Tar Heel State by Patty Wilson. There's boozeandspirits.com, colonialghost.com, and mysteriousuniverse.org. Special thanks to actor Tom Gore for lending his vocal talents to this episode. This episode was researched and written by Jeff Cochran and is produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find every episode of the Carolina Haints podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or you can listen directly from the feed at carolinahaints.libsyn.com. Please be sure to leave us a review and share the show with a friend. As always, you can learn more about us and the Carolina Haints book by following us on Facebook at facebook.com/CarolinaHaints. And visit our official website, carolinahaints.com. As always, you can contact us directly at carolinahaints@gmail.com. As you may have heard, we're expanding the scope of Carolina Haints and are working to bring you legends and lore historical markers to some of the creepiest places around the Carolinas. We'll be installing our first marker this year, with more details coming soon. And the best part is, you can help us by contributing to our Patreon page. Find out more about what we have to offer, such as monthly mini episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and our map of monsters and legends. All of these perks can be yours exclusively through a membership with Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/CarolinaHaints. Check it out and please consider joining us today. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about those things that go bump in the night.